When it comes to border security, when it comes to the free flow across the border, of course, the two countries have famously had a very open border. Has that changed a little bit now? Are we seeing, especially when it comes to people trying to cross into the United States, are we seeing that has changed somewhat, and that a number of people are not finding it as easy to travel freely across the border?
The answer is yes, but that's not new. I mean, really, this hardly bears repeating, but the pivotal moment was 2001. And then again in 8-9 with challenges to the economy, you see a lot of what we might call economic migrants. So you've got some big challenges that moved us in that direction. And then as we saw threats from outside the continent, there was pressure from the United States to at least partially arm the border, and I think that's happened. And I think legitimately border guards on both sides really don't want to be that person who makes that one mistake. So I think there's a heightened level of vigilance, and it's a difficult job. So I think yes.
And we talked about NAFTA a little bit earlier. There have been some other trade issues that have been thorny between the Canada and the United States, softwood lumber and now dairy between,
Sure.
But before they didn't really, they weren't in the headlines, and they weren't necessarily major issues between the U.S. and Canada, or were they?
Well, my view is slightly different. We in Canada have been concerned with free trade since Confederation 150 years ago. There is a history of a small number of irritants getting a large amount of attention. So whether it's softwood lumber or dairy or steel stamping or raspberries, we find that there's always going to be some areas where politics and economics collide, and we have some angst. The truth of the matter is that represents a very small portion of what is a very large trade relationship. And I think we'd all be well advised to keep that in mind, that while the softwood lumber issue is difficult, at the same time, a huge amount of trade transits the borders, goods and services, every day in an effective and non-controversial kind of way.
With the new administration and a new Congress, though, could some of those issues grow into much bigger issues?
They could. I think you're going to find, though, that just because there's a Republican Congress and a Republican administration, they're not necessarily going to see eye to eye on all these issues. In some places, let's say New Hampshire, where the dairy industry is very important, you can see that being a flashpoint. Whereas in Michigan or Minnesota, they're not going to have the same kind of concern for that. The administration is going to have to balance those things off, their commitment to growing the American economy and buying American against the value of having stable flow of goods and services and a productive and functioning economy.
And you mentioned a very valid point. Even though you do have both houses controlled by Republicans, you have a Republican in the White House. Even though Mr. Trump famously said things were going to happen on day one and happen quickly, through the years, you've seen where that does not necessarily happen.
No, and the political system in the United States is such that it really can't happen, because 39 governors, a great majority of members of the Congress, need to be reelected next November. And, all politics is local. All politics is absolutely local. So these folks have to be sensitive to the needs and the interests of their constituents. And there will be points at which there's a conflict between the administration's priorities and the individual members' goals and priorities.
And where the president said that he was going to renegotiate NAFTA immediately, is that something that could drag out for a year or two? And if it runs into 2018 or beyond, does that have an impact on Canada and your federal elections?
I think it does. The challenge here is we thought that during the campaign, like many candidates, Mr. Trump was very forceful on his views, very clear about his direction, and many of us thought, he might slow down a little when he wins the election. That hasn't been the case so far. The Commerce Secretary did in fact say that the NAFTA renegotiations are going ahead. My guess, though, is that it may have more impact on the Canadian election than the American, because it will probably go slowly enough that it doesn't challenge a lot of those individual members' re-election. But if you think about the normal length of time for something like this, which is probably a couple of years, it will be back to our electoral cycle, and we will be past the midterm elections in the U.S.
And Mr. Trudeau really has already reacted to the new administration even before the inauguration with a shakeup of his cabinet. Was that directly in anticipation of the Trump administration coming in?
I said this morning that it was. But I think this, when a new prime minister comes in, typically, and a new president, typically some of those appointments are made based on a person's service, their career, the role they think they should have. Mr. Dion was an ideal choice for foreign minister in the short run, but cabinet shuffles are a part of parliamentary democracy. We were all expecting there to be a shuffle at some point, and typically about a year in or 15 months is when you see that first cabinet shuffle, first major shuffle. Chrystia Freeland is a very impressive person, and many of us were imagining that she was going to get one of the top jobs. I think the fact that the outcome of the election is what it was, a sort of hard-nosed, very effective person who has an incredible knowledge of the United States, I think it sped up that process or made it all that much more likely that there was going to be that shift from Mr. Dion to Minister Freeland.
But not a direct correlation reacting to the incoming administration.
So. I think she was, only the Prime Minister knows the answer to that question. But if I were guessing 6 months ago, I'd say she was our next foreign minister. The question was exactly when. I think the timing drove that decision, but I think the decision was made before that.
And we did talk about defense. Do you see any other areas where Mr. Trudeau may have to react to the new administration?
Well, I think Mr. Trudeau's view on foreign policy, broadly speaking, is going to be different than this Trump administration's view on foreign policy. But remember, these are two countries that have played a very different role in the world. The United States has been a system leader and has played the role of lender of last resort, of consumer of last resort, of security guarantor. And Canada's played more of a role as a kind of very engaged middle power, very interested in making sure that the international system and all its various pieces function well and that we have a role in that. I think we're going to return, or are returning, or have returned to that role. And I think the real changes are going to take place on the American side. And the question then is, will that cause any sort of tension?
And for the folks who aren't familiar, as Executive Director of Fulbright Canada, tell us about your program and what you do.
Sure. So Fulbright is a worldwide program. We operate in 166 countries around the world. Our goal is to enhance mutual understanding between the people of the United States and people all around the world. My job is the Canada-US piece of this. What we do is provide money to students, to scholars. We support conferences. We support academic research. But our real goal is to move people. It's what we political scientists used to call democratic peace theory. We believe that the more we know about the rest of the world and the more the rest of the world knows about us, the more stable, the more peaceful, and the more prosperous we'll all be. When we appreciate the fact that everybody's goals at the end of the day are about educating their children, putting a roof over their head, living in a stable and healthy environment, we're a little more sympathetic when things go badly. So I think, Fulbright is one of those things that it's about public diplomacy, it's about soft power, but at the end of the day, it's really about supporting young men and women who will be future leaders and who will and need to develop a deeper understanding of the rest of the world.
And you've been the leader of Fulbright Canada since 2001. Have you seen
2001?
You've seen quite a bit of growth of the program?
I've seen an enormous growth, both in the program worldwide, not only in the numbers, but in the depth of the program. We're celebrating our 70th anniversary worldwide. So the program started right after the Second World War in 1946. And what we saw is a program that was very carefully organized to make sure that we had bilateral relationships that were strong and healthy. Canada, US, Mexico, US, US, UK, US, France. What we've seen in the last 10 years, and in particular in our program in Canada, is the growth of a slightly more nuanced understanding with how the world works. So it's not just US, Canada. When we're dealing with Arctic issues, we need to think about Iceland and Norway and Denmark and Sweden, and indeed Russia. So we see that those bundle of issues, whether they're about health and human welfare or infrastructure or energy, impact all of those Arctic Council countries and beyond. So we've moved in the direction where we're trying to include some multi-country programming. We're trying to make sure that we address issues that are critical and key for everyone, issues relating to the environment, but to public health and to borders and to safety and security.
And the more people that are enlightened, the better they
That is our
deal
hope.
with changes like this, where you have new administrations and
I
test
think-
relationships.
I think our hope is that we encourage people who are positive and focused, but at the same time realistic and hardworking. We need citizens who both understand that there are challenges in the world, but are also at the same time prepared to work to resolve them.
Michael Hawes, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us.
My pleasure.